When I was a junior in high school, there was a girl I spent a lot of time thinking about. Her name was Sienna Rollins. She had this alluring, almost cold presence that was hard to explain. She wasn't popular, and most people found her intimidating or just weird, but I found her fascinating. Catching her eye felt like a sudden gust of winter wind. She reminded me of fresh snow, beautiful but capable of muffling everything around you, including your own thoughts. I was obsessed with the mysteries she seemed to hold. I was a writer back then, and I even named a character in one of my stories Sienna. One day, I was talking to my friend George about that story when I mentioned her name just as the real Sienna turned the corner. She flashed me a smirk, the closest she ever got to a smile, and joked about me being in love with her. I was mortified, but in a moment of sheer impulse, I asked her out. She gave me her famous icy stare, then surprisingly agreed and gave me her number. That was how I ended up on a hike with a girl I had spent months obsessing over. The hike wasn't my idea. Sienna picked the trail and organized everything. On the day of the trip, she drove us 45 minutes out to a remote gravel lot at the base of a trail I'd never heard of. There were only two other cars there. Sienna didn't hesitate. She just started walking and I followed. For the first 20 minutes, she was more talkative than I'd ever seen her, even asking about my writing. Eventually, the trail narrowed and the woods grew dense. We hadn't seen another soul since the parking lot. We reached a fork in the path, and Sienna pointed left without a second thought. When I asked if she'd been here before, she said no, but she seemed incredibly sure of where we were going. The left fork was overgrown and poorly maintained. Sienna gestured for me to take the lead, and we began walking single file. After a while, I realized I couldn't hear her footsteps behind me anymore. I turned around and the trail was empty. Sienna was gone. I yelled her name into the trees, but there was no response. I walked back to the fork, thinking she might have stopped for a moment, but she wasn't there either. There were no side trails she could have wandered onto. She had simply vanished. I decided to try the right fork, calling her name like an idiot. Deeper in the woods, I heard a branch snap to my left. I saw movement behind a thick tree and felt a wave of relief. I thought Sienna was playing one of her typical mind games with me. I decided to turn the tables and scare her first. I crept toward the tree and jumped out with a yell. It wasn't Sienna. It was a man. He was tall, middle-aged, and didn't look scared in the slightest. I blurted out that I was just looking for my friend, but he didn't care. He started walking toward me. I backed away, trying to reach the trail, when I heard another sound to my right. A second man was standing in the open, watching me, holding a heavy tree branch. I turned and bolted. Both men immediately started running after me, crashing through the brush. I ran blindly through the dense woods until something grabbed my ankle and slammed me into the ground. It was the first man, and he was trying to pin me down. I kicked and screamed with everything I had, and by some miracle, I broke free and kept running. My mouth was full of blood, but I didn't stop until I found the main trail and made it back to the parking lot. Sienna's car was still there, but the other two vehicles were gone. She was nowhere in sight. I was frantic, thinking those men had caught her, and I called her phone repeatedly. Right as I was about to call the police, she texted me asking where I'd gone. I looked up and saw her walking out of the tree line, completely calm and unbothered. I tried to explain what happened, but she seemed more irritated than concerned. On the drive back, she claimed she had simply thought I'd gone ahead of her and spent the whole time trying to catch up. But I knew that was a lie. I had walked all the way back to the fork. I wouldn't have missed her. It dawned on me then that the entire thing felt orchestrated. The trail she chose, the fork she picked, the way she insisted I go first, and how two strangers appeared the moment she disappeared. I never saw her again after that day. Everyone I've told this story to says the same thing. Sienna set me up. I have no idea why she would do it, and I have no idea where she is now, but I never went back to those woods again. I've lived in Alaska most of my life. I've been a professional wilderness guide since my early 20s, so I don't usually get rattled out in the bush. I'm 29 now, and I've always felt like the woods were my home until 3 years ago. At the time, I was dating a guy named Randy. He was just as experienced as I was, especially when it came to winter navigation. We had planned a snowmobile trip between two remote state-registered cabins about 60 miles apart. We'd done this trip twice before and never had an issue. The plan was simple: 4 days out, a night at each cabin and back home. But the morning of the second day, a full-on blizzard hit out of nowhere. We should have stayed put, but we decided to brave the storm to reach the next cabin. The visibility was zero. Randy was leading the way, and I was just trying to follow his tracks. One second he was moving fine, and the next, his snowmobile had flipped and pinned him. When I reached him, I knew it was bad. His leg was bent at an angle that made me feel sick just looking at it. I tried everything to get him on my machine, but he was over 200 pounds and dead weight. Every time I tried to move him, he'd slide off. Eventually, we had to face the reality. I had to leave him there. I gave him every extra layer I had, marked our coordinates on the GPS, and told him I'd be back with help. I felt a knot in my stomach as I rode away, leaving him alone in the whiteout. I was navigating by feel, fighting back panic. After about 45 minutes, nothing looked right. I felt like I was looping, and then, through the trees, I saw it: smoke. I thought I'd somehow found the cabin, but as I got closer, I realized this structure didn't match the state cabins. It was smaller, uglier, and half buried in a snowdrift. Desperate for a radio or a way to warm up, I killed the engine and knocked. No one answered, but the door was unlocked. Inside, it was strangely warm. A fire was roaring in the stove, and a bedroll was laid out on the floor. There was even a can of food with a spoon still in it, as if someone had just stepped out minutes before. I called out, but the house remained silent. As I turned to leave, I noticed a shelf on the back wall. There were binoculars, a map, and a notebook. I opened the map and felt my blood run cold. It was a trail map of this exact area, but certain spots were circled in red, including both of the cabins we had stayed at. I picked up the notebook. It was filled with handwriting, detailed descriptions of people, what they were wearing, and which direction they were traveling. Randy and I were likely in there. The cabin didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a hunter's blind. I dropped everything and turned for the door, but before I could reach the handle, the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard ripped through the air. It didn't come from the woods. It came from directly beneath my feet, under the floorboards. It was a woman, screaming at the top of her lungs like she was being tortured. The shock made me jump. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted to my snowmobile, started it, and rode as fast as the machine would go without ever looking back. I eventually made it to the real cabin and called in a helicopter. They saved Randy. He was hypothermic and his leg was shattered, but he lived. I told the troopers everything about the small cabin and the woman screaming under the floor. A few days later, they sent a team out, but they told me they couldn't find any structure matching my description. They actually suggested I had hallucinated the whole thing due to the stress and the cold. Randy and I broke up a year later, but I still think about that day. Either I had a 10-minute hallucination so vivid it felt real, or there is a woman still under those floorboards in a cabin that no one else can find. Or worse, it was a trap, and if I had arrived 5 minutes earlier, it would have been me screaming under the floor. I've been a freelance land surveyor for about 15 years. Most of my work involves solo, remote assignments where I'm camping out for days in places most people will never see. I used to prefer the solitude, until 4 years ago. I was hired to survey boundary markers in the Clearwater region of Idaho. It was incredibly remote. I had to hike 6 miles just to set up my base camp. The first day went smoothly, but on the second day, a light forecast turned into a heavy snowstorm. I should have hunkered down, but I pushed on to find one last marker. That was my first mistake. While picking my way down an icy embankment, my boots slipped. I slid 15 feet before catching myself on a tree root. The pain in my right ankle was instant and sickening. I had severely sprained it, and in those woods, limited mobility is a death sentence. I abandoned the work and began the grueling, limping hike back to camp. That's when I saw them, fresh boot tracks on the trail. They were heading in the same direction as me. I figured it was a hunter or another worker, so I didn't panic yet. But as the light began to fade, I started hearing footsteps behind me. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped too, but always with a 1-second delay. It was as if someone was mimicking my pace. Because of my ankle, I couldn't run. I was a sitting duck. Then I heard a metallic clink to my left, like someone tapping a fence post. There shouldn't have been anything metallic out there. I looked down and realized the tracks I'd been following were gone. I looked into the tree line and saw a second set of tracks running parallel to mine. Whoever had been ahead of me was now walking alongside me, hidden in the shadows of the trees. 000541, the encounter at camp. I finally reached my campsite just as it got fully dark. I scrambled into my tent, but the thin nylon offered no protection. I began packing frantically, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps circling the tent. For 5 minutes I sat in total silence, clutching a small tool, waiting for them to rip the fabric open. The silence returned. I took a deep breath, unzipped the flap, and stepped out. I turned my light toward the trees and nearly screamed. A man was standing in the tree line, staring directly at me. He looked sickly, almost skeletal, with a hollow, disgusting expression. We stood in a terrifying staring contest for what felt like hours. I raised my hands and told him I didn't want any trouble. He didn't move. Finally, he spoke 3 words that still haunt my dreams. "You're a lucky man." Then he turned and vanished into the darkness. I packed the rest of my gear in a blur of pain and terror and left that night. I still do remote work, but I never camp alone on winter assignments anymore. That man didn't want my gear. He was waiting to see if I'd give up. The woods have a way of making you feel small, but it's the silence that's the most dangerous. Whether it's an orchestrated trap by someone you thought you knew, a hidden cabin with a dark secret, or a stalker waiting for you to trip, the wilderness holds shadows that don't always belong to the trees. If you're planning a trip into the deep woods, remember, you might be tracking the path, but someone else might be tracking you. Trust your gut and never ignore that feeling of being watched. If you have a story from the great outdoors that you can't explain, send it to the channel. We're always listening. Until next time, keep your fire bright and your tent zipped tight.